Part 1. The Scale of the Mystery. Before we hear the individual voices, it helps to understand the sheer scale of what we are dealing with. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, commonly known as the BFRO, is the largest and most systematic database of Bigfoot sighting reports in the world. As of recent counts, it holds more than 5,000 documented reports from across the United States and Canada. These are not casual internet comments. Each report in the database has been reviewed and, where possible, investigated by a field researcher. Reports that lack sufficient detail or credibility are filtered out. What remains is a carefully curated body of testimony that spans every decade from the early 20th century to the present day. 5,000 reports. Across 49 of the 50 United States. Across every Canadian province. The 3 states with the highest concentration of reports are Washington, California, and Oregon, the heart of the Pacific Northwest. But reports come from Florida, from Ohio, from Texas, from Michigan, from the forests of the Southeast and the woodlands of the Great Plains. Whatever is being encountered, whatever people are seeing, hearing, and smelling in the wilderness, it is not a phenomenon confined to one region. It is distributed, consistent, and persistent. Let that settle for a moment. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Part 2. The Early Record. The written record of Bigfoot-like encounters in North America stretches back well into the 19th century, and in indigenous oral tradition, much further than that. One of the earliest widely reported accounts in English-language media dates to 1884. A British Columbia newspaper called the Daily Colonist published a story about a creature captured near Yale in the Fraser River Canyon. The creature was described as half man, half beast, covered in glossy black hair about an inch long. It walked upright. It was given the name Jacko by the men who found it. What became of Jacko after the initial report is unclear. The story fades from the record. But its appearance in a mainstream newspaper of the time is notable. Something prompted someone to write it down. In 1924, a group of miners working on the slopes of Mount St. Helens in Washington state reported a terrifying night. Fred Beck was one of them. He described how, after shooting at one of several large, ape-like creatures they had spotted near their cabin, the beings returned after dark. For hours through the night, the cabin was pelted with large rocks. The walls shook. The door buckled. The men held their position until dawn, then evacuated. The site became known as Ape Canyon, a name it still carries today. Beck later wrote a detailed account of the encounter that was published privately. Investigators who visited the site afterward found large footprints pressed deep into the earth around the cabin. In the summer of 1941, a woman named Jeannie Chapman and her children fled their home near Ruby Creek in British Columbia after encountering a massive creature near their property. Her husband, William, who was working nearby, returned to find the family gone. He followed their trail and then discovered what had frightened them. Enormous tracks, estimated at 16 inches in length, pressed into the soft ground near the house. Inside, a barrel of saltfish had been opened and its contents scattered. Investigators, including naturalist John Green, who would later become one of the most respected researchers in the field, documented the case thoroughly. These early accounts share a quality that is worth noting. They were not reported by people seeking fame. They were reported, often reluctantly, by people describing something that had frightened them, confused them, or simply left them unable to explain what they had seen. Part 3. The Era of Footprints. The 1950s and 1960s brought a new chapter in the documented history of Bigfoot. It was an era defined not just by sightings, but by physical evidence left in the ground. We have already heard of Jerry Crew and the Bluff Creek construction site in 1958, but the footprints found at Bluff Creek that year were not isolated. Over the following months and years, the same general area of Northern California and Southern Oregon there came what researchers would come to call a hotspot. In 1960, a man named Bob Titmus, a taxidermist and skilled tracker from Anderson, California, began investigating the Bluff Creek area systematically. Titmus had an unusual level of expertise in animal tracks. He had spent decades casting and studying the footprints of known North American wildlife. When he examined the tracks at Bluff Creek, his assessment was blunt. These were not made by any animal he had ever encountered. The dermal ridge patterns, essentially the fingerprint equivalent features on the soles of the feet, were visible in the best preserved casts. This was significant. Hoaxers rarely thought to fake dermal ridges. The features matched what you would expect from a large primate. Titmus went on to document dozens of separate trackways over subsequent years. He was meticulous, methodical, and skeptical by professional nature. His conclusion remained consistent throughout his life. Something real was making these tracks. In 1967, the same year as the Patterson-Gimlin film, a separate and independent set of tracks was discovered near Bossburg, Washington. What made the Bossburg tracks unusual, and what drew serious attention from scientists, was that one of the feet showed a deformity. The right foot appeared to have a clubbed toe. Anatomically, the deformity was consistent and mechanically logical. Primatologist John Napier, who examined casts of the tracks, wrote that the deformity was too anatomically precise to be easily faked. A hoaxer would need detailed knowledge of primate foot pathology to fabricate it convincingly. Napier was not a committed believer. He was deeply skeptical of much Bigfoot evidence. But the Bossburg tracks gave him genuine pause. Part 4. Voices from the Field. Let us now hear from the witnesses themselves. In 1969, a logger named Glenn Thomas was working in the forests of Skamania County, Washington, a county that, notably, passed an ordinance in 1969 making it illegal to kill a Bigfoot, citing the possible existence of the creature as grounds. Thomas was operating equipment alone in a remote section of forest when he became aware of a large figure standing at the tree line, approximately 60 yards away. He described it as standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, watching him with what he could only describe as calm curiosity. They observed each other for approximately 2 minutes. Then the figure turned and walked into the trees. Thomas said he sat in his machine for a long time afterward before he could bring himself to move. In 1974, a highway patrol officer named Dennis Jose was driving a rural road in Grays Harbor County, Washington, in the early morning hours when his headlights illuminated a large, upright figure crossing the road ahead of him. He brought the vehicle to a stop. The figure continued across the road without haste, he said, as though entirely unconcerned by the car. It cleared the road in 3 strides. Jose estimated its height at between 7 and 8 feet. He filed a report. His supervisors, he later said, did not know what to do with it. In 1976, a family camping in the Olympic National Forest in Washington state reported a series of encounters over 2 nights. On the first night, they heard heavy bipedal footsteps circling their campsite in the dark. On the second night, their cooler, a heavy latched model, was found the following morning moved approximately 30 feet from where they had left it and opened. Whatever had opened it had done so without breaking the latch. They left the campsite a day early. In August of 1978, a wildlife biologist working for the U.S. Forest Service in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington was conducting a survey of a remote watershed when she smelled something that stopped her in her tracks. She described it in her written report as a combination of wet dog, skunk, and something else she had no reference for. Shortly afterward, she heard heavy footsteps in the brush, approximately 40 meters to her left. she could not see the source. She left the area and reported the experience to her supervisor. The report was filed and, as far as she was aware, went nowhere. In 1994, a retired schoolteacher named William Rowe provided a detailed affidavit, a sworn statement, describing a close encounter he had experienced near Mica Mountain in British Columbia in 1955. Rowe stated that he had observed a large female creature at close range for several minutes before it became aware of him and retreated into the brush. He described its facial features in unusual detail: a flat nose, a protruding lower lip, small, dark eyes set wide apart. His description predated the Patterson-Gimlin film by 12 years, and yet is remarkably consistent with later accounts. Because it was filed as a legal affidavit, Rowe was swearing to its truth under penalty of law. Part 5. The sound evidence. While footprints and visual sightings form the most discussed category of Bigfoot evidence, the acoustic record is perhaps the most haunting. In 1972, a recording was made in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California by a man named Ron Moorhead and his hunting partner Al Berry. They had been camping in a remote area of the mountains, accessible only by a long hike from the nearest road, when they began hearing vocalizations in the night that did not match any animal either of them recognized. Moorhead had a cassette recorder. He pressed record. What he captured has come to be known as the Sierra sounds. The recordings feature extended vocalizations, long, modulated calls, guttural sounds, and what some researchers have interpreted as a form of structured communication between multiple individuals. The sounds were analyzed by a cryptolinguist at the University of Wyoming named R. Lynn Curlin, who concluded that the vocalizations showed characteristics inconsistent with known animals and were produced by a vocal tract significantly larger than a human's. No definitive explanation has ever been established for the Sierra sounds. In 2012, a team of researchers submitted audio evidence gathered from the forests of the Sierra Nevada to a group of experts under what became known as the Ketchum DNA study. Among the audio files were recordings of large objects being thrown through the forest canopy at night, and vocalizations heard at close range. Independent of these documented cases, dozens of researchers have recorded what is termed wood knocking in remote forest locations. The rhythmic, deliberate striking of wood against wood that appears to be too regular and too structured to be attributed to woodpeckers or falling branches. Accounts of wood knocking as a communication method appear, independently, in indigenous testimony from multiple tribes, in early 20th century logging camp accounts, and in modern field research reports. The consistency across time and source is striking. Let your breathing slow even further. There is no hurry here. Just listen. Part 6. Trained eyes. Some of the most compelling Bigfoot testimony comes from people whose professional training makes their observations particularly difficult to dismiss. In 1995, a veteran game warden in the state of Georgia named Claude Connor was patrolling a remote section of national forest when he encountered a set of tracks in a muddy creek crossing that he could not identify. Connor had 20 years of experience identifying animal tracks. He made photographs and plaster casts. He later stated that in his professional opinion, the tracks were made by a large bipedal primate, unlike any species he was aware of inhabiting North America. In 2000, a search and rescue coordinator for a county in the Cascade Mountain Range stated in an interview with a Bigfoot research organization that over his career, he had received multiple reports from wilderness rescue subjects who, in the course of their ordeal, had encountered large, upright figures they could not identify. He noted that these individuals, already traumatized by their situation, were not trying to be believed on the subject. They mentioned it almost in passing as part of their account of what had happened to them. In 2004, a former U.S. Army Ranger and wilderness survival instructor named Tom Burnett began systematic field research in the mountains of North Carolina. Over several years of methodical searching, Establishing trail cameras, collecting samples, documenting trackways, he built a body of evidence he presented to researchers and journalists. His background gave him specific skills in tracking and identifying movement patterns in wilderness terrain. His conclusion, drawn from professional training applied to years of personal investigation, was that a large primate was moving through the mountains of western North Carolina on a regular basis. The pattern here is not that trained professionals are more credulous than ordinary people. The pattern is that people with professional reasons to understand what they are looking at, people for whom misidentification would carry professional consequences, are among those reporting encounters. Part 7. The physical evidence. Question. No discussion of Bigfoot accounts would be complete without an honest look at the physical evidence question. It is true that no Bigfoot body has ever been confirmed. No bones, no definitive biological sample. This is the central challenge the subject faces in gaining scientific acceptance, and it is a legitimate challenge. However, the absence of confirmed physical evidence is not the same as the absence of physical evidence entirely. In 2012, a scientist named Dr. Melba Ketchum led a study that claimed to have analyzed DNA samples from alleged Bigfoot sources: hair, blood, and tissue collected from multiple sites across North America. The study's conclusions were controversial and were not accepted by the mainstream scientific community, which raised concerns about methodology and peer review. Ketchum maintained that the results indicated a novel species of primate. The debate around the Ketchum study has never been fully resolved. Hair samples collected from Bigfoot encounter sites have been submitted to laboratories on multiple occasions. In many cases, the results have come back as inconclusive or consistent with known animals. But in a smaller number of cases, results have indicated samples that could not be matched to any species in existing reference databases. These results are not proof, but they are not nothing. Perhaps the most rigorous physical evidence examination came in 2014, when a team led by Oxford University geneticist Brian Sykes analyzed a large collection of alleged Bigfoot hair samples as part of a broader study on anomalous primate claims worldwide. Most samples were matched to known species, but 2 samples from the Himalayan region returned unexpected results. A genetic profile matching an ancient polar bear lineage. The North American samples in Sykes' study were mostly attributed to known animals. But the study demonstrated something important. The methodology for seriously examining such claims exists, and when applied rigorously, it sometimes produces surprising results. The physical evidence question remains open. Not answered, but open. Part 8. A geography of encounters. Pull back for a moment and look at the map. The Pacific Northwest accounts for the highest concentration of reports. The Olympic Peninsula, the Cascades, the Coast Range, the forests of Northern California. These are places of extraordinary biodiversity, ancient tree cover, and in many areas extreme remoteness. But the Appalachian Corridor, stretching from Georgia and the Carolinas north through Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and into New York and New England, carries its own substantial record. The density of forest, the age of the mountains, and the persistence of rural isolation in many Appalachian communities has created conditions where, if such a creature exists, it would face relatively low pressure from human encroachment. The Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, have generated hundreds of reports, many of them from hunters in hardwood forests during deer season. Ohio alone has a surprising number of documented cases, concentrated in the river valleys and forested hills of the southeast part of the state, an area sometimes informally called Ohio's Bigfoot Triangle. Florida has its own variant, the skunk ape, reports of which have come from the swamps and cypress forests of the Everglades and Big Cypress regions. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has received reports. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office received a photograph in 2000, mailed anonymously, showing a large, upright, hair-covered figure standing in what appeared to be a suburban backyard near the edge of a wooded area. The image was never definitively explained. Texas and Oklahoma carry reports from the Piney Woods region in the east, dense, humid pine forest that stretches along the border between the two states. The area is remote enough and the canopy thick enough that portions of it have never been systematically surveyed. In each of these regions, the reports follow the wilderness. They follow the trees, the rivers, the places where humans have not yet fully displaced the wild. That's all for today. The voice may fade, but the fire will keep burning. So just close your eyes. Good night.